Hi, I'm Thilo, and this is Thilo's Theology Service. Hi, I'm Thilo, and welcome to the shop. Today we're going to jump to part 2 with my friend Daniel Hanna, discussing Athanasius on the Incarnation. And where we left off before was an excellent place to stop, which was at the concept of the Logos, which in itself is a pretty complicated discussion. So what I'd like Daniel to do is to begin by introducing the concept of the Logos as it would be understood in Greek philosophical terms. And then perhaps, Daniel, if you can jump to Philo of Alexandria and his comparison of this Logos concept to the Jewish concept of the personification of wisdom that we would see in Proverbs and the Psalms. And then we'll move forward to the New Testament Christians and how they basically utilize that same concept of a logos to explain Christ and who he is. So with that, Daniel, it's all yours.
So the logos is first used as a philosophical term in the 6th century BC by a philosopher named Heraclitus. Heraclitus was a natural philosopher, meaning that he contemplated upon the nature of the physical world, and he thought that all elements were always in a state of flux, that you would never step in the same river twice. Things are always changing. There's no constancy of being. However, he thought that there was this organizing principle to the universe that made sense of the world, and that was called the Logos. That application of the word Logos has very little to bear with the concept of the Logos as we have it in the New Testament. But then you move down the line, Plato used the word logos too in a similar fashion, but it was a bit more sublime than what Heraclitus thought, because for Plato, there was some sense of permanency in the world. And that's what his philosophy was focused on, how to understand what's really true and the things that are apparently true. Then moving down the history of philosophy, Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who had read for Plato, and was quite a bit impressed with him to the point that he kind of used his terminology to expound the Jewish scriptures, talks about the Logos in the way that Solomon talked about the wisdom of God in Proverbs chapters 1 through 9. And that's where we have to go if we are to understand the Logos, to the Proverbs. The way Solomon described wisdom, it's not simply a poetic personification. I mean, you often find that in the Psalms and the Proverbs because they are poetry. So they often personify different types of non-living objects. But for wisdom, it's different. Wisdom, it is a personification, but they're trying to say something more there. Something along the lines that there is this type of existence that has the attributes of God and that God used to create the world. And that's where Philo developed his idea of the Logos. He used that term because the Greeks would have been familiar with it, as well as Greek-speaking Jews, to describe all those functions of wisdom in the Old Testament. And it's interesting because it's not only the Psalms and Proverbs that talk about the wisdom of God, but also the book of Baruch, the wisdom of Sirach, and the book of wisdom. In Baruch, it even goes so far to say that wisdom will dwell among men and live and be seen among them. And it's not in the sense of personification, but he has just gone, I believe, on for about a chapter and a half.
Well, in all fairness, Christ himself is an icon of the Father, of God. And in some sense, everything conveyed to us is anthropomorphic. In a way, it all has to convey it in terms we can understand. It can never be in terms as God would understand it within himself, because we don't have that capacity. So I think there's kind of a middle place in between personification in anthropomorphic terms and literal realities, I think there's a middle place where it's kind of drawing on both ends, don't you?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And to go further back to what Plato was talking about, and Philo after him, Plato mentioned that there were rational realities, and we discussed that at length in the last video on St. Athanasius' first book, Contradiction. And Plato called these the forms. Now, there was a problem with the forms. Where do they exist? From where do they draw their origin? Plato said they were independent existences, and God was independent of them. They were independent of God. But Philo placed the origin of the ideas in the logos. And that's really where we start to see now at that point how the Christians pretty much took this idea of the logos to describe our Lord Jesus Christ, because it is indeed who he is. And we can say that philosophy had prepared a way, almost in a sort of prophecy for the Gentiles, to be able to accept Christ through this developed idea of the logos in Greek philosophy.
Now, don't you think that this is sort of at the time, sort of the height to which one can conceive of God and to grasp him through relatively natural processes without him manifesting, revealing himself in a very specified way, that in our clouded human condition, this was pretty remarkable to come this close to really understanding what was going on.
Oh, yes. And if I might add, too, it took a Jewish philosopher using the scriptures to be able to bring it full circle to a very close understanding, because that was the problem of Plato. It's actually called the problem of universals in philosophy. Where do we place the forms? From where do they come? If we can even use place to describe them.
Give us a thumbnail of forms and a couple of examples.
So the forms are the rational patterns on which particular physical realities are modeled. So for example, when we see human beings, they all have similar features. They all have speech. They all have the ability to think. They stand on 2 feet. And when we abstract that general idea of the human, we get this idea of humanity. Now, Plato didn't see it as an abstraction. Plato saw it as there's this independent pattern upon which all humans participate, and that's what makes them human. Now, he also used it about other ideas like mathematics, triangles, squares, different types of shapes. These do not exist in physical world, but we can recognize their patterns in the physical world when the physical world participates in them. So these are called the forms. Now, I'm giving a very, very light.
Yeah, obviously.
It goes a lot. It's much more nuanced and elegant than this. But it's the idea that there are these rational realities out there. We would understand them as abstract, but we understand abstract as something that doesn't exist on their own. For Plato, these things existed on their own. And it's only when particular matter participates in them that we can recognize their pattern in the physical world.
So basically, he saw these as eternal self-existent realities?
Yes.
Interesting. And so without cause, organization, or a mind behind them, that our minds are able to grasp and relate to, yet they did not come from a mind.
Yes, and that's what was difficult for him, because when he described his God, he believed that there was a one craftsman God, if I use the term. He wasn't a creator because he didn't speak things into existence. But for Plato, there was God, who he called the demiurge, then the forms, then unformed matter. The demiurge used the forms to shape matter into the world we have today. So his God is a shaper. He's not a creator.
And this is huge. I mean, this is the gaping hole, the problem that doesn't get filled, that something to exist eternally and in a self-existent way, independent of another, presuming this God would be an eternal being, independent of another eternal. That I mean, without going into it, that really has some huge logical and philosophical gaps to it. And go on.
Oh, yeah. And he actually saw God as one of those forms. God is form, meaning he is independent, eternally existent, not matter, but he's the highest of all the forms. But it still doesn't describe where the other forms come from, like you said.
Yeah, or how we came to possess mind, which without mind, those forms are not recognizable as forms, and they don't exist in any real way.
And that was the interesting thing, because Plato saw that the mind was the image of the divine. He saw it, in Christian terms, the image of God in humanity. And actually, the early church fathers, a lot of them thought that Plato had gone to the Middle East and had met the Jews and had read the scriptures. But when he came back to Greece, he was afraid to introduce a new religion because he saw what happened to his teacher for just simply talking a little bit differently within the same religious tradition. Now, whether or not that happened, it's very difficult to tell. But without a doubt, we can say that Plato's ideas about God and the nature of the world and how it came to be, it's not Greek in origin. This is something else altogether.
Interesting. So let's go more in now to the Logos and its sort of role as an intermediary between this divine and us as the created.
So Thilo saw that all the forms, he solved the problem of the universals, giving one solution. There are many solutions, by the way, to this problem. But he said that the forms do not have an independent existence outside of the Logos. Their origin is in the Logos, and that's where they come from. So the same Logos that works on the universe to create it has the forms in him, in his mind, so to say, and they draw their being from him.
Wow, that's very close, isn't it?
Oh, yes. So that's where we pick up with the Gospel of John. So I like to go over the first chapter because this is where the Logos is most expounded in the New Testament, and indeed probably in the whole of the Christian tradition. Nothing comes better at explaining the Logos than John chapter 1.
I've found it very funny when I've heard people wrongly criticize, philosophy and Greek philosophy, just kind of cracked up. Like, have you ever read John 1? I mean, this is Greek philosophy, but applied, it's the language and the concepts applied into our scenario to give a very, very fitting, it's almost like translating something into a language, and so it's using this language, which is very readily prepped to expound on these concepts.
Oh, yes, and that's exactly what he's doing. If we are to be good preachers of the gospel of Christ, we have to speak in the language that the people can understand. And that doesn't mean just languages, English, Arabic, Spanish, but we are actually using concepts people are familiar with too in their cultures to explain the gospel of Christ.
And isn't this exactly what Christ did, talking about shepherds and seeds and planting, and he was drawing on imagery that was known. And with John, rightly, we have the symbol of the eagle for his gospel. This is some pretty lofty stuff that he's drawing on.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, Christ preached in the villages and some of the major cities of Judea and Galilee. But when you look at Paul, he was preaching in the cities of the ancient Greco-Roman world. He uses different ways of speaking to share the same gospel of Christ. So we'll go to John chapter 1. And it says, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And the idea is the word God used here for the Logos was God. It's not God in the sense of God as the specific one God, but in the idea of the divine. That everything God is, the Logos is. And that, I mean, reading the context of the Gospel of John, it's not two gods. It's very clear there's one God. So it's a distinction, not a difference.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's saying with, meaning a distinct person, yet was God, meaning the same reality.
Yeah. And even the word with, it's interesting how it's translated in specific languages, even from Latin all the way to Arabic. It doesn't mean with as standing side by side, but it means with in the idea of in possession of. This is something God has, the Logos.
Well, certainly the Jehovah's Witnesses have seen the problem with that very famous verse and opening to the gospel, because they had to work on retranslating it. And clearly, I think John here is aware that what he is writing is huge, and it's scripture, because he's beginning this like Genesis 1. And we've been very familiar with Genesis 1.
He's hearkening back to Genesis, going back to the creation, because he knows the image it will evoke in the mind of both Jewish and Greek readers. That in the beginning, this being that he's about to speak about, the Logos, he's already there.
Yes. Yeah, this is the New Testament, Genesis 1.
Yes.
Go on.
So then he continues, saying he was in the beginning with God. He was in the beginning means before the creation. He's starting to create with God. And this is where it gets important, because the Arians, when they started speaking about Christ as the first creation of God, it simply does not go with what John is saying here.
Great. Keep going. I'm listening.
And that also points out he's eternal, because if he precedes the creation, time is a part of creation. If there is no time, by definition, that's eternity.
All things were made by him. Without him, nothing which was made. So this puts him preceding everything.
Yes, and this is where it gets very interesting now, because the word that we translate as made, especially in the New King James Version, which is very popular, it's not quite made in the sense of Genesis 1, where it says God made the heaven and the earth and so on. It's a lot deeper than that. The word that John uses should be translated, all things came into being through him. And without him, not one thing came into being, which has come into being. He's tracing out the origin of things that exist to the Logos. He's not simply fashioning them. He's not even shaping them. He's the one who is bringing them into existence.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have, I believe, in translations of Genesis 1, a distinction between made and created. Those are two different concepts.
Yeah. But in the Septuagint, it used the term to make, the Greek verb is pio, to describe everything, whether it's created or made.
I see.
John is even stepping away from that, and even from the Jewish explanation, to speak in more philosophical terms, that being itself is coming through him.
Well, I'm not, if I ever did look this up in the Hebrew, it isn't recent enough to be in my memory, but I believe there was a distinction in the original Hebrew between created and made.
Oh, yes. In the original Hebrew there is, but in the Septuagint translation, they translated both terms into the Greek verb pio.
I see.
So I believe it was used 3 times, and the word bara in Hebrew, which means create, I think it was used 3 times in Genesis chapter 1, and the last time is about humanity itself. Every time.
Clearly, we have things that are fashioned from what was created. And my wife's boss, from Reasons to Believe, they do scientific apologetics. And one of his strong emphases is that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And what we translate as heavens and the earth is kind of a phrase, a specific, it's not just two words, it's a phrase that basically speaks of all time, matter, energy, and existence.
Oh, yes, yes.
You know, all coming into being. And so after that point, when you see everything's fashioned from what was made, and then you see, again, like you say, humanity, there's something new being introduced that did not exist even in the animal world, you know, which would, you know, these things were fashioned, and man was actually made and created, wasn't he?
Yes, he even points out that the dirt was fashioned first, then breathed into, and that breath gave humanity its unique character.
So we have a making and creating in humanity.
Yeah, and it's not opposed to each other, because the one who's created everything, he's the one stepping in and working in his own creation. He's not stepping away, and that's the heart of theism.
Exactly. Go on, go on.
So it goes on. Now, you point out that the phrase heaven and earth is not just specifically the two specific realms of existence, but it actually describes the totality of creation. And what the Greeks used for that word was cosmos, which we have in science still today to mean the entire universe. So John continues and says, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light, and men here does not mean, you know, males, it means humanity. The Greek word is anthropon, which is humanity. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. But the word comprehend means here to overcome. So what's interesting here is that this light is not some type of physical light. It's not even simply spiritual light. It is illumination. And Athanasius, he used that throughout the entire first volume of On the Incarnation, the book Contradiction, to indicate illumination of the mind. So he's the creator of life, and in human life specifically, he has given them the ability to understand the creation so that they are not left in the darkness. And this is important to note, because even till today in science, scientists often discuss why we can even comprehend the universe. It was Einstein that said that the eternal mystery of the universe is that it is comprehensible. And Galileo, he didn't have the same difficulties that Einstein had, because Einstein was not a believer, but Galileo was. He said it's these, to go back to Plato, it's the rational realities, logic, and specifically for Galileo, mathematics. They're like candles that allow us to navigate through a dark room. And the Logos is what contains logic and mathematics, the rational realities. And because he has created the universe, using them because they're proper to him, and we're created in his image, then we're able also to understand the universe that he has created and his being permeates.
Wow, that's so huge.
So that's what the light here means. And we'll talk further, because the Gnostics, who Athanasius definitely has in mind, and who were definitely in mind when John wrote his gospel, they had this idea about the light too. So John continues saying he was in the world, and here we go, cosmos, so heaven and earth, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. So he's present in the creation, but the world did not know him. And the Gnostics, this is important to note, believe that the maker, to use Plato's term, the demiurge, that's what they used because they were Platonists in some way. They believed that the demiurge of the world was evil, and that the father of Christ was not the demiurge. And that actually takes some, we have to step away and explain what the Gnostics believed at this point. Now, the background of the Gospel of John is that it was written because a Gnostic heretic named Cerinthus was spreading a lot of Gnostic teachings, and it was starting to affect the disciples of John. So his followers begged him to write the Gospel, and he did. So when we say that the Gospel of John was influenced by the Gnostics, influence means one out of two things. It can either be a borrowing of, or it can be a reaction against. Most people, when they hear influence, oh, he must have borrowed from it. No, he was writing against them. So he has to use their own terminology.
You know, that is huge, that when we see things in the scriptures, we need to understand when somebody is stepping into a proposed reality to argue against it from within it. And one of the most common that I point to is when St. Paul speaks about the very famous passage that Calvinists draw on about the potter, you know, creating vessels, fashioning them, and for whatever purpose he wants. And but right there in the text, you see that somebody is, this imaginary interlocutor is saying, hey, if God made everything, why are you blaming me, you know, for being bad? And he says, but he doesn't say, no, God didn't make you bad. He goes into their point of view and says, even if that's true, you have no basis to argue against it, because you'd be arguing against the one who made you think this in the first place. So he's really kind of showing from within your argument, just like when he argues within the context of the law with the Jews, he's borrowing an existent understanding and arguing within that framework. That doesn't mean that is his primary framework. It just means he's stepping within it to show it doesn't work within your framework.
Right, and that was the whole point. He's pointing out to them, if this was really the case, you can't even think these thoughts. But if you can, then you have to reimagine your world and what you believe about why you're sinning. And actually, I like to point out that the second epistle of Clement and the Apostolic Fathers, which was probably written in Rome, interestingly enough, explains this analogy of the potter. And it points out that we have the ability to reshape ourselves so long as we live. But once we die, it's like when the pots are placed in the kiln and you're fired up, at that point you cannot reshape it anymore. What's there is there. So, I mean, there's the interpretation right there, less than 70 years after the Epistle to the Romans was written.
And Clement would have, I believe, would have known St. Paul, wouldn't he?
Well, it's not clear who wrote
John, clearly John, anyway.
Oh, yeah. But it's still not clear who wrote Second Clement. It could have been him. It could have been someone from his community. It never actually says in the text. It's just a sermon. But it's very early nonetheless, because it was referenced by the very early fathers as well. But, I mean, there's the interpretation right there. We come 1,600 years later and introduce a new one, taking literal what was meant to be like a diatribe. So,
yeah, I think for those unfamiliar, an imaginary argument partner who is a representative of some common argument against the faith, and then arguing back and forth, you know, with this person. It was probably the most common tool in explaining something.
Yes, and that was indeed the premise of Plato's dialogues. That's what made them so popular, because he sets it out right away. So-and-so saying this and so-and-so saying that. With Paul, it's not so much so-and-so, but here's the viewpoints and here's how we answer. It's the same idea, except it doesn't put names on it, because Paul was much more tact than Plato.
Well, and it's more than that. I think that, you know, I was, it's funny, I just had a discussion today about this, but I was a skeptic and an atheist. And my biggest problem with the gospel, with Christians and the idea of God at that time, was the suffering and the evil I saw all around me. And as it turns out, having spent years in apologetics and discussing with various cynics and atheists and skeptics, legitimate, honest skeptics that are just looking, this is just a resounding theme that goes over and over. And like in the same way, I point out to some of my Calvinist friends that all you do is argue over this one issue of the free will of man and the sovereignty of God as you understand that sovereignty. If that had been the thing preached by the apostles, this obviously does create a buzz that you'd see it permeating writings and you'd never see it show up. That This is so counterintuitive, this idea of this moral imperative being upon us that we have no ability to fulfill, that immediately this would be the obvious objection to that. So if this is what Paul believed, then you'd see it everywhere that people would be arguing against it, but you see it nowhere. And I think in the same way, when St. Paul picks up a position that he's arguing against, it's because this would be a very natural, common one from a group of people, like the issue of the law and the Jews and so on. So that's why you tend to see there's really not a need to put one name on it, because you're probably hearing it a lot.
Yeah, and I can never quite bring myself to separate Platonism from Calvinism, especially the predestination that they preach there, because Plotinus, the Neoplatonist we mentioned in the last video, did believe in some type of predestination, and he did believe that the type of evil things that we did in the flesh and the body, they did not affect our souls. They were a result of the body, which is inherently not good. He didn't so much as say evil, because he also did not like the Gnostics, who were using Plato's philosophy, mixing it in with Christianity, and creating this syncretism that was not acceptable to Christians and Platonists. But his idea of predestination is very similar. I mean, let me go back. His idea of no matter what the body does, it will not affect the soul, is very similar to the idea that no matter what you sin after you have really been saved, you will still end up in heaven if God has predestined you to be there.
Yes, yes, very much so.
So, and that needs to be pointed out, because if, Plotinus was against the Christians, now why would he hold such a similar belief knowing where it could lead?
Yes.
And how come the Christians got on him for that? Because Augustine, for example, who read Plotinus, he wrote against him on this point. He said that he could not accept the idea that no matter what the body does, it can never affect the soul. And we know from psychology now that the Christians are right, that what we do in the body affects our psyche. And too much, it will have to lead to some type of intervention, whether that becomes therapy because of drug usage in the body, or whether that leads to counseling because people are not well organized in their lives. What we do in the body does affect the soul.
Well, yeah, we're composite beings. There's no aspect that dwells independent of the other two.
Yeah. So what the Gnostics believed, and this is important to note because both St. John and St. Athanasius had the Gnostics in mind when they wrote their texts. They believed that there was this one high God on the very top of the chain of divinity, and most systems had about 30 gods under him. They called them eons. The demiurge was one of those gods, and he created this world, and because he was not the highest God, he created a very faulty one, and that's where they traced out, this is the origin of evil. There was a God who created who should not have created. Then the Christ, he's one of these 30 eons, but he does the will of his Father, the Father being the highest God, and he comes down to humanity to bring them the way of knowledge of truth, to be able to ascend this chain of divinity to reach the Father. And
this does kind of hearken me back to the very concept we were just talking about in Calvinism of determinism. So, within the Christian sphere, we understand man as having an amount of self-direction and self-determination. But all of this keeps looking for a primary cause for why things are so messed up, and saying, it's a very deterministic view that it had to be caused by something that determined it to be this way. And it seems to neglect the concept of a being with a free will and a volition that actually could be given something that is pristine and right and screw it all up. That screw up doesn't have to come from the creation. It can be caused by a self-directing being.
Oh, yes, yes. And yeah, I mean, clearly Plotinus' system did not consider what we do in the body to be part of our wills. Our wills are in the soul, and the body will do what it is. And Paul had that too, but Paul was a bit more nuanced than that. He acknowledged that one aspect of the body can do that, not all the body. Because the body, and this is what shows that Christianity was not transformed by Greek philosophy, is because they have continued to insist on the holiness of the body. That was unacceptable to Greek philosophy, whether it was Plato or Plotinus or even the Gnostics. And that's where we come to next now. When John said he was in the world and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him, he's saying that Christ himself is the creator. The demiurge is Christ. There is no difference between the two. So he's challenging and breaking down the Gnostic system upon itself, that there's no chain of divinity, that Christ himself is the creator. Then it's interesting because I'd like to go here to Colossians. Paul pointed out, he said, "For in him dwells the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and you have come to fullness in him who is the head of all principality and power." That word Godhead, it means the state of being divine. In Gnostic terminology, that described the 30 gods, the totality. So he's saying that there's no 30 gods. He's not one of them. The whole of it dwells in him. And not in him, but bodily. So he's turning the system upside down.
This is, if there is a Greek philosophy heresy, such a lofty view of the body. I think wasn't it Celsus who said, who mocked us, the foolishness of the Greeks, that we hoped for a resurrection, which would be, according to them, a return to a dungeon that we had just been liberated from. And he said this would be fitting to an earthworm, as I recall.
Yeah. I mean, there was no eternal place for the body. This was something that had to be shed. And Christians, by definition, look forward and hope in the resurrection of the body.
And that is foolishness to the Greek.
Yeah.
Just as much as a crucified Messiah is an offense to the Jew.
But what was beautiful about it is that it overturned the system of Neoplatonism. I mean, the paganism of the 3rd and 4th centuries was so challenged by Christianity because when they emphasized the body, they put the responsibility of what the body does in us, in our souls. And that's morally superior to all paganism. No matter what you think your body does or your soul does, but not your body, that was a much more superior system, and it attracted a lot of people.
So that really seems to be an introduction of this concept of self-direction.
Oh, yes, definitely.
And I think it, if I'm not mistaken, it was Origen who was the first to really get in there and engage on some very complex philosophical level, and had the world philosophers coming to debate him because he had really taken these things to such a high level of understanding that we really hadn't moved into before. Is that your understanding?
Oh, definitely. And this is a very good place to point out that Plotinus was a fellow student with Origen in Alexandria. They both had the same teacher, Ammonius. And not only that, but Plotinus' student Porphyry attended the lectures of Origen.
Wow.
They were fully aware of each other. They were challenging each other at the same time, and I'd argue that that challenging of each other continues on till the late 4th century, where Basil, Gregory, and Gregory are engaging with Julian the Apostate. Julian having converted to paganism from Christianity to the Neoplatonist tradition, and Basil, Gregory, and Gregory following the teachings of Origen and engaging the two. It goes on for a long time, and one prevails in the end.
But Origen, as I understand it, he was the kind of, in a way, the first one that the Greek philosophers took seriously.
Probably so. There's not much evidence for the other ones, but definitely there was a lot of reaction to Origen because he was a powerhouse of knowledge and philosophy. Irenaeus of Lyon, also a powerhouse. I mean, there's no clear evidence of anyone having reacted to him, and so on. But
yeah, he seems to have kind of brought this on the world philosophical stage.
Oh yes, and he's a world philosopher in his own right. I mean, I heard it said, and I would probably agree with it, All Christian theology after Origin is either an agreement with them or a reaction against them.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So continuing with the idea of the Logos in John says, all who received him, Christ, the Logos, who believed in his name, he gave power. And here the word power is not like strength, energy, it's authority, exousia, to become children of God. And no one can have that authority except God himself. So he's making it very clear that the one he's talking about is God. I can't give someone authority to become anything unless I have that authority myself.
Yes, absolutely.
Then he continues, and the Logos became flesh. And here again, John now is also attacking the Gnostics, turning their world upside down. Flesh is inherently evil, spirit is good. He's saying, well, that Logos, the spirit, became flesh and lived among us, and we beheld his glory. And then he points out it's not the glory of the only begotten of the Father. It's the glory as of an only begotten, because he's hearkening back to them. Those eons you believe in, they're not there. There's only one, and that's the Logos.
Terrific. I think we need to start bumping forward a little into the Incarnation, or we're going to go into a third episode.
Oh, yeah.
So into, now that we kind of have the framework of concepts, how, the different imagery that Athanasius gives us about salvation itself as a process of healing and restoring something that was damaged. And really this whole concept of it being something that's legally in place to heal God in his inward damage done by us in sinning. It's really all about healing us and restoring us.
Yeah, so just to recap from Contradiction, we discussed that sin was viewed as an infection, as a disorder, as a sickness. It primarily affects the way that we exercise our free will. We choose the worst for the better. So that inherently has to be healed. There's no other way to deal with it.
And this, again, resolves the issue that you would have, well, this was all this bungled creation by this messed up lesser God, and actually says, no, the creation itself was good and it got damaged. So we don't see something that is inherently evil. We see something that is inherently good that got distorted and damaged, which again, you can't avoid the parallels to some of the earlier Protestant thought that really kind of laid it all out as being inherently evil, the utter, total depravity of man and so on, that we have a much more optimistic view of humanity as not something that is so depraved and utterly evil, but it's something that was made good and just got damaged and can be repaired.
Oh, yes. And I mean, it's very easy to point that out. I think it's, we think about evil in the world and nobody can deny that there is. But when we think about why there is goodness in the world, that begs for an explanation. And the fact that goodness is all there too indicates that this is something inherent to creation. So when the Christians came up with the idea, and you see this also expressed in Contradiction and on the Incarnation, that sin is you choose the worst for the better, they point out that that worse is inherently good in itself in some way. It's just the way that it was chosen and compared to what that made it evil.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have, a standard by which you're measuring. And there is no standard of evil, but there is a standard of good.
Oh, yes. And evil is only recognized through the standard of the good.
Exactly. It's, in Washington, D.C., I believe, in the Department of Weights and Measures, in a glass case, they have a 1 kilogram sample. And it's like the standard. And I forget what material it's made from, but it's because it doesn't really fluctuate with temperature and so on. This is the thing by which all standard units of the kilogram are compared and modeled and made by this standard, and then other standards are made, but this is the fixed by which we know what something is. And this is such, oh my gosh, this is such a reputation of the postmodern thought in America, that my subjective goosebumps are the standard by which all things are measured. And this abandonment of a concrete fixed reality by which we measure things.
Oh, yes. So moving on from that idea of evil as being a choice, it leads into the problem of on the incarnation, which is humanity was created, but then it fell. And God said that they would die because of what they did, their sin. But then God is also good. They call that the divine dilemma. Now, I'm not sure it's a dilemma, so to say, but you definitely see that God said something's going to happen, but he's inherently good, and what's going to happen here is evil.
Well, I think this is an important place to introduce this concept or reiterate this concept that this is anthropomorphic. That, you know, when St. Athanasius says, what was God to do? You know, I call that the divine facepalm. Like, oh my gosh, now what? This is a tool of argument, you know, showing God having this dilemma of being good. And St. Athanasius really stresses, okay, but what was he going to do? He had given his word that this would happen. On the other hand, could he abandon this thing that was in his own image that was in itself good? That wouldn't be fitting either. And then he goes on to give the resolution. But keeping in mind, this is anthropomorphic. This is not literal, because this, if you take this literally, you're saying God didn't know the fall would happen.
Oh, yeah.
That it caught him off guard.
And that's the beauty of St. Athanasius. The best way I can describe him for modern audiences is C.S. Lewis of the 4th century. Because, and I mean, it's actually the other way around, because
yes. Who influenced whom?
Yeah, C.S. Lewis, at least every book I've read for him, and I've read quite a few, he's referenced him by name.
Oh, who writes the intro to On the Incarnation in the most common translations we have?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, his intro on the Incarnation, Mere Christianity, he references him. Miracles, he references him. Even the book, The Discarded Image, he references him. But the idea is that he speaks in a way that his readers can understand, and they can elevate their thinking to higher levels of spiritual contemplation. But did God know? Absolutely he did. All the other fathers are agreed upon that. I mean, even St. Isaac the Syrian so beautifully portrays it. He says, how great is God's love? There in the midst of the garden was the tree before they sinned. And the tree here, it's hearkening back the idea of the cross. So it's beautiful.
Yeah, I think so. It's important not to extrapolate from that writing what's not there, which is God being responsive to a dilemma, as opposed to God being the omniscient one who foreknew this dilemma before it occurred.
Yeah. So the idea is that St. Athanasius starts the book with is that we have this dilemma. We were created with the indestructible image of God in us, but then because of the sin, he said that we would die. He says something evil and totally against our nature is going to happen, and then this is against his goodness. So what happens? The idea is this will hold true unless some type of change happens in humanity. And that's what the book is focused on. How did this change come about? And that change comes about through the incarnation of the Logos.
Go on.
So he continues after that and points out that if God is good, he will not choose destruction over salvation. Yet God's prediction, his statement that humanity will die because of sin, cannot fail. So what happens? The Logos himself decides to become one of us, to heal and recreate the image that has fallen, that has become clouded in us.
The most concise thing I've heard, there was a guy online named Perry Robertson, and he put it in such an eloquent, simple way. He said, the problem with humanity was intrinsic, and an intrinsic problem cannot be resolved through an extrinsic solution. Yeah. And that's simply, that if the problem were, a legal matter, that would be an extrinsic problem. That would be something outside of us, this legal problem we have with God. But if the problem's within us, the thing that's causing us to sin, that can't be resolved by something outside of us. It has to be something that comes inside of us.
Oh, yes. And I had a student one time, a middle schooler, but a very gifted one at that. We had a debate in a public speaking group after school, and it was about whether children should be physically disciplined, spanked. And this boy just came out of nowhere, and I let him argue whatever they wish. They're students. I cannot limit their argument. He says that no matter how much physical punishment can happen, it can't change you on the inside. And he said only God can do that. And this is a 12-year-old boy, and he's right. Even when we think about the law, when people fear punishment, it has not changed them on the inside. It has just taught them how to avoid trouble. If that is taken away, who knows what they'll do? But some people...
I mean, that's, this is the thing, that you can constrain behavior, but not the desire.
Right. You can't constrain the desire. You can't change the inside. And this is what's important to note. Christ came to heal us psychologically too, where St. Athanasius went off on the psychology of paganism in part 1 of Contra Gentes. Now he's talking about this recreation of the image of God, which is the rational soul, and both its capacity for knowledge and morality. He's coming to heal and recreate this once more. So that's where on the Incarnation picks up. Now, what's interesting with him is that he does not really distinguish between the Incarnation, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension. They're all serving the same purpose for him. They're all stages of that recreation in us.
Oh, this was for me as a convert. We had one point that we focused on of salvation, which was the cross. This is where God's justice gets satisfied. This understanding of our salvation having so many aspects of Christ, beginning with the Annunciation and moving forward to the birth, to the baptism, to all of these things. And it's so amazing to me that now, when somebody asks me, I say, they say, how are you saved? I'm saved by all of it. And I'm saved by your prayers. And I'm saved by the prayers of the saints. I'm saved by my priest in confession and giving me spiritual guidance. I'm saved by communion. I'm saved from all of these things. I mean, all of these work together to affect the change of person, of being, that is salvation itself. And once you understand salvation as being an intrinsic issue of changing the state of being, then anything which works toward the goal of changing that state of being is salvific.
Oh, yes. And he uses the word, the monument to his victory, and sometimes the monument to our victory, to describe both actually three things: the cross, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. And like you pointed out,
ascension. We have the ascension. All of it together.
Yeah. So there's this idea that it all works together. It all fits together as one piece. When we focus too much on the cross, as in Protestantism, it takes away from the full meaning of salvation and the idea of the victory that Christ has won over death, sin, and the powers of evil, which is what we see in Orthodoxy. We go in any Easter service, it's all about victory. It's a victory celebration. We have won the war.
For those who are unfamiliar with some of these distinctions, in Protestantism, it's what's generally referred to as a juridical model of salvation, of some form of penal substitution or divine satisfaction, meaning that a penalty has to be imposed in order to satisfy justice, and it's really not named, but justice has to be an attribute within God. So here again, we're looking at something healing God, or whether it's in our understanding, it's not this way. It is a broader healing, restorative understanding of salvation. And so I think these two distinctions are really important for us as Orthodox to understand, that this isn't about making something right within God. This is a much more healing, holistic issue that makes us right again.
Yes, and that's extremely important to note, because we lose that in the idea of penal substitution.
And we have a couple of theories, they're called theories in Orthodoxy, ways of explaining this. One is the ransom, meaning like we were held captive. And it's, again, as I think it was Gregory, I don't remember, I think maybe the theologian who was saying, well, if we were held for ransom, well, it wasn't God holding us for ransom, and he certainly wouldn't pay the devil. And, in our understanding, it's just an image given saying we were trapped and held. And it's kind of like by the nature of things as they are, we were trapped and held, and somebody had to give something back into this situation to make it right. So this is, what we as Orthodox refer to as the ransom theory. And then the more common one that we have is what you're referring to, which is labeled the Christus Victor theory, which is to say that Christ is the conqueror and the victor over death and hell and Satan in order to set us free.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd even say it's even deeper than just victory, but also the idea of recreation. And this important note, when you go back even to the Apostolic Fathers, there's this epistle, the Epistle of Barnabas, and he sets out not many different, but I should say a very clear idea of the atonement. And he uses the words recreation and destruction of death. And he uses recreation multiple times. What Christ has done, he has come to recreate us. And I can't but help and think that Athanasius read that. I know Athanasius was familiar with Clement of Alexandria, and Clement of Alexandria referenced the Epistle of Barnabas. So there's this idea, it goes on from the very beginning up until Athanasius, and even beyond him to today is us with Orthodox Christianity, that salvation is, we can say it in multiple ways. It's a victory over sin, death, and the powers of evil. It is a a healing of the problem that was in us, and a recreation of that image of God that had become clouded up with the way that we were living.
And for those, unfamiliar again with this, I think the basic concept is that Christ as man is able to enter into death, but through the power of his divinity, death can't hold him. And so when he breaks the bonds of death, that's what opens the door for everybody else who is human, as he is human.
Yeah, and that actually brings to mind the sacraments. I mean, we have to presuppose the sacraments in the 4th century church. The reason this doesn't make sense to a lot of Protestants is that they believe that the sacraments were always considered symbols. This is definitely not the case.
Well, it's funny. I had this discussion with a Protestant friend, and he actually pointed to a few fathers who used the word symbol, but didn't understand, no, that Greek word symbol, I'm always hesitant when I hear, viewing it as a symbol. Properly speaking, with the Greek concept of symbolos, that is to throw together with, and a symbol is not something separate from the reality, it's something in the reality.
And if I may even add, the word symbolos also means the idea of belief. So like the creed is called symbolon in Greek. It's not a symbol of anything. It's a laying out of what we believe. So the idea is that once we're baptized and we have put on Christ, we have become part of his actual body, and that body has resurrected. So death will not hold us either.
We are if we died with Christ and raised with him, we are living in him in that resurrected life of his.
Yeah, and our death is only temporary, and the soul does not go to Hades any longer.
And that's why we changed the term. We stopped using the term death, didn't we?
Yeah.
We used the term going to sleep.
Yeah, going to sleep, repose, because it was Christ that said, "I'm the resurrection and the life," again in the Gospel of John. This
is a nap.
Yeah. And he said, "He who believes in me, though he may die, he will live. And he who believes in me will never die." And I mean, it's clear. John's writing this 60 years after the events. It's clear he's not literally speaking here. He's talking about living after death and also resurrection at the very end of time.
Well, yeah, because the term die, if we understand it to have your physical life terminated forever, trapped in this existence without a physical being, if that's the definition of death, then we will not die, but we will only fall asleep.
Right. So we're not held to Hades anymore. So that's what he means. We will always live even if we die. But he also means that in the future, at the end of the world, we will also resurrect. And that's very important, because that's the ultimate sign of victory. But how does that happen in Orthodox thought? And again, we have to presuppose the sacraments, because in the last video, we talked about all the different types of context. The sacraments were always considered as real communications of grace and the way to entry into the life of Christ. So how do we partake of his defeat of death? If we become part of his body, because he's the only one who has defeated it. But when we put him on, we share in that victory.
Yes.
Then continuing, Athanasius starts using analogies to explain what Christ has done. They're very beautiful. There are 4 analogies that he uses of the Incarnation and how it started defeating the powers of evil. He gives an analogy of the great king dwelling in a single house in the city. There are so many houses, so many people, and they will be vulnerable. But the enemies of the king will be afraid to approach the city if the great king is there. Then he also gives a similar analogy. The king who has conquered certain lands will not allow them to be reconquered, and he sends letters and friends and even visits them himself. And that becomes an analogy for the apostles and the prophets and even the fathers. They're there to keep us within that city by their preaching and teaching.
Continue.
Then the very famous analogy, which is the only one that seems to carry into popular thinking, is the analogy of the stained portrait and the repainting of the subject.
I think that's because it is an amazing analogy.
It is amazing. But he points out, we're like a stained portrait. We were, you paint on a wooden, back then it was a wooden panel. It wasn't canvas like we have today. And through time, that portrait becomes stained so that you can no longer see the image clearly. So what was the solution? The subject that was originally painted comes back, sits down, and on the same wooden panel that was stained, the image is repainted. And that's what's happening with us. We have the image of God recreated in us, that psychological healing. Psychological here, I like to point out the word psyche means soul and mind. So both the soul and the mind are healed. And when we follow the example of Christ, we have that pattern to follow. We live like him. And that's very important to note, because St. Athanasius points out that one of the proofs of the resurrection is martyrdom. That people, even little children and women, who are usually more afraid of death than men, because, men go into wars all the time. Children stay at home and they're so afraid of even cats meowing outside in the street. They were not afraid to go to the martyrdom. Why? Because they have that pattern. It transformed the way that they live. It actually changed them. And that's the evidence of the healing of the Logos.
I'd like to take a quick side tangent here.
Yeah.
So many Orthodox, we hold a very high view of martyrdom, as we should. But I think so often we miss the Christian life being one of smaller martyrdoms, that we forget that what martyrdom is a giving up of everything. I mean, you'd give up that shirt and your computer and the place you're living in, that chair behind you, your friends, your family, all these things you'd be losing. All the things you use for entertainment to fulfill so many things. You're giving all of that up and losing all of that. But we look at this one big event and say, okay, there are martyrs, and we miss that during Great Lent and during our fasting seasons, and in the Christian life itself, is supposed to be one of martyrdom, where we are saying goodbye to so many things and letting go of them in favor of the greater kingdom. which is what the capital M martyrdom is. And we seem to have so much emphasis at times on the capital M one that we miss the significance of the lowercase m martyrdoms that we're supposed to encounter and make a part of our daily lives.
Yeah, and again, that's the pattern of the Logos, this idea that he emptied himself and became of no reputation, and even took the form of a slave of all things. And
I gotta say that so often I see Orthodox churches, and unfortunately I see this in the Coptic church frequently, trying to copy Western and Protestant and evangelical models in trying to make this more interesting for the young people, and trying to kind of revamp our orthodoxy to engage more. And it's this approach as though we had a marketing problem. But the reality is we don't. We have a product problem, because our product is a cross. And to go to somebody's house and say, hey, would you like to sign up for your own demise? It's a hard sell, and we shouldn't be surprised that it's not going to be attractive to a lot of people to undertake this loss, this death that precedes the resurrection. I mean, what we are offering is the resurrection at the end, but up front, there's no false advertising. He's hanging on a cross in our church. It's clear this is the road to God, is in this self-emptying, which is the very most prominent symbol in our faith.
yeah, and it's the idea of values too. I think in the West, because everything comes so easily and comfortably, we don't have a clear sense of value anymore. This is why I think that in places like China and Africa, they're so receptive to the gospel, because they have a clear sense of what's important. But we don't. I mean, kids cry if they don't get the newest model of the iPhone. And I mean, they'll really cry, shed tears more than anything else. But they won't cry about how bad they're failing their schoolwork. And I mean, it's clear there's no value there. So it's like, this is the ultimate value, Christ crucified.
A while back, I actually sat down and I did the math. And I figured out that we will be dead longer than we were alive. And upon coming to this brilliant mathematical conclusion, it occurred to me that what happens after we die is infinitely more important than what happens here in this very transient existence.
Yeah. So, I mean, all those ideas come in on the Incarnation and Orthodoxy. I mean, and you mentioned that the Copts, have a product problem. I'd say it's even further than that. They don't even know what makes them uniquely Coptic. When you go back to the fathers, I found so much personally, so much spiritual benefit from them than from anything else. And many of them are not hard to read at all. The Apostolic Fathers is a great place to start. They're so practical, oriented, and so easy to understand. And they just illuminate where the New Testament left off. They make it so much the clearer. But you will never find that in modern writings. C.S. Lewis comes pretty close, but it's because he's read for them.
He is considered by most an honorary Orthodox.
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, he let them, and he consciously let them, and explicitly mentioned it, let them transform the way he think. And I mean, it's no coincidence that the man who converted him was a Catholic, and one that was well read in the Fathers too. So there were those discussions. They weren't talking about the Christianity of their times, but the mere Christianity, that eternal one that you can find very clearly expressed in the Fathers.
Very good. Very good. Go on.
So St. Athanasius continues with analogies for the destruction of death. And he gives 5 analogies. I have them numbered 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 because I also like to focus on all the analogies he made. So some were for the Incarnation, some were for the destruction of death. And he gives an example of asbestos and fire, and I like this. People, the believers are clothed in asbestos and they walk through fire. So the fire will not burn them in any way. And again, that harkens back to baptism, putting on Christ. And the light on the darkness. When the sun rises, the darkness disappears, fades away. Or the boys making fun of a lion. If they are, it's because it's bound up or it's dead. So And this is what's important to note, not one of his analogies is juridical.
Okay, this is huge. If the gospel that St. Paul preached was this juridical gospel, then that notion of satisfying God's divine justice because somebody has to pay as a metaphysical reality, that would be the gospel. This would be the one thing that I'd be hearing from all the fathers who were in all the communities that were taught by St. Paul himself. Because he didn't just, they didn't pick up Bibles and figure this out. He spent years with them before he ever wrote them a letter. So what they had in their very fabric and framework, if it were this juridical understanding, this would have been the thing that they used to describe it. The fact that there are so many different images that are given to us of what salvation is tells me that it, first of all, wasn't simply what is being presented in the West. And secondly, it tells me that it is something that in itself, as God knows it, transcends us. Because we have to draw, it is like. Like when Jesus is teaching and he says, the kingdom of God is like. That there's a reality here that we have to know by analogy because we don't have the capacity to understand it as it is known by God within himself.
And this is true of all knowledge. All knowledge requires analogy, even scientific thinking. It all begins as analogy. I mean, the whole idea of gravity, it was first explained as a golden chain coming out of the sun, connecting all the planets together. And when it spins, because they're all chained up to the sun, they move with it. So analogy, I mean, it's a very essential part of all knowledge.
Anything with which we don't have direct experience can only be understood through analogy.
Oh, yes. And I love the fact that you mentioned Paul spent years in the communities that he was preaching, because people don't quite understand that. They see modern preachers, they go for a 2-day revival crusade, and they say, oh my gosh, he converted all of Nigeria, or converted wherever. And the reality is he spent 2.5 years in Ephesus. He spent 1.5 years in Corinth. And I can tell you as a teacher personally, when students spend that much time with a teacher, the teacher builds a strong community relationship. Children have a clear understanding. So I want you to imagine adults over the course of 2.5 years, they have received the fullness of the gospel preached in Paul. So that's important to note. But also, I like to point out, some people give the objection that, it must be a paradox then, that it's both a victory and a healing, but it's also a punishment and a debt satisfied. And I'd like to make a comment on that, because that shows the people who make this clearly don't understand what a paradox is. A paradox is an apparently self-contradictory statement, which when further considered shows a deeper truth. Here are some examples. She was present in class, but she was not present in class. I'm not contradicting myself. She's sitting right there, but she's not listening. So present and present have two different meanings. Or the teacher was absent in class, yet he made his presence felt to his students, because while he's not there, the assignments given are his. Or my favorite one, being bad feels pretty good. You clearly don't mean good and bad in the same way here. So they're not contradictory when further considered, because one side of each statement is referring to the body, while the other side's referring to the mind. And here's
the difference between paradox and contradiction.
Oh, yes.
It has to be speaking in the same exact way to be a contradiction.
Yeah. So here are some theological examples. The infinite became finite. The timeless became temporal, and so on. Now, they're not contradictory because, again, when further considered, one's according to the divinity of Christ, and the other aspect is humanity. But when you say that victory and satisfying a debt punishment are inherently paradox, they're inherently contradictory, because both of them are referring to the same aspect, not to different aspects of the atonement. This is not paradoxical thinking. It's totally contradictory thinking. So that's important to note. That's why St. Athanasius doesn't use juridical models at all. All his analogies shows some type of defeat of death and a victory for the one who has defeated it. And not only that, but it shows this continuing spiritual safety for those who believe in Christ. That if they follow him, nothing will touch their faith. It will not touch that logos that now lives in them through baptism.
Wow, this is good. Go on.
So again, in part 3, he uses this idea of the monument of our victory, and these are the times that he uses it. I believe it's 6 times. There's one he uses it twice, I think. So he describes the cross, and I have the references here to the St. Vladimir's edition, the first edition, not the Father John Bear one, but the one that came before that. He also describes his death as the glorious monument to death's defeat. It is he himself who has brought death to naught and daily raises monuments to his victory in his own disciples. Everyone who lives a transformed life is a monument to his victory. And so on. So this is, like you said, it's very optimistic. It goes on to the point where, there's martyrdom, there's persecution, there's difficulty in living in this world. But this does not stop the Christians from viewing the world as something good, as something beautiful, as something that should be engaged, both in its physical aspect and its human aspect. And that type of thinking transformed the ancient world. Even the pagans, I mentioned Neoplatonism, not the last phase, the phase that happened in the 4th century with Julian the Apostate. I heard it once said that the most Christian of all the Roman emperors that were Christian was Julian the Apostate. This is now a paradox. It's not a contradiction. Because when he reacted against Christianity, he didn't notice how much it had transformed him already. The way that he changed paganism, he centralized the priesthood, which was the Christian way of priesthood. It was centralized in the bishops and in the synods. He also created social services, something that paganism never had. He took it from the Christian models. So what he did not notice at the end was that he created a Christianized form of paganism.
I will take a short tangent here, that when I hear atheists arguing against Christianity, very often they're doing it on moral grounds, and they're not even aware that their very bare value system is Christian. They don't realize they were taught it, that it was given to them by a culture and a society in the West that built it off those scriptures and off that New Testament, that the very concept of the intrinsic value of a human life as the base point of morality is so inherently Christian that in the Greek world, you had a deformed baby, you put him out in the elements to die. There was no intrinsic value. That was when the Christians came, why they got accused of kidnapping, because they would take this child in and care for it. That so many of these values that they're using to argue how we're immoral, they don't even realize the only reason they have them was because of Christianity. That's where they came from.
And this is a good point to bring this, at least this part, to an end, but I like to separate between morality and values. The two are not the same. You can't make sense of morality without values, but values are not inherent to morality. They have to come from somewhere else. It's like if we talk about reasoning capabilities and knowledge, everyone has reasoning, but they cannot have knowledge without education. Everyone has morality, but they can't order it in a value system, except if one is presented to them. And the one that was presented in the West and still has power over it is Christianity. They can argue that all humans are moral. Absolutely. That's part of the image of God in us. But the value system, that's the work of the incarnate Logos and how he lived his life and the gospel and how that was preached by his apostles and kept by the church throughout the generations.
Well, and there's no offering of a grounding for the value of a human life without God. there's just it's there. Well, nothing has any intrinsic value without God.
No. And that's the idea of the logos. We're all created in his image. So all of us who bear that image are infinitely valuable. So even a baby, a deformed one, cannot be set out for exposure to die. That one has to be taken in, because now you are preserving the image of the logos in him. And in that way, you are following Christ and worshiping him and showing that you are following the model that he set for us in his own life.
Wow. I think this is a good place to taper this off.
I think so.
Daniel, I can't thank you enough. I've been getting some very positive responses about our last discussion, and I personally like this one even more. The other one was more fact-oriented. This seems to be going more to the heart of the matters.
Yes, definitely so. And that's the thing that we should remember from the fathers, is that there's all this theory, but this theory enters our heart and it becomes practice.
Well, thank you. And I'd like you to, for people who have not met you and heard you before, I understand you have a website, a place where people can read things you've written.
Yes. So my website is danielhannawriter.com. My last name is spelled Hanna. So it's one word, danielhannawriter.com. And I write frequently on patristics and many other topics, ranging from spirituality to short articles on specific biblical books, patristics, apologetics, and I also post our videos on there too. But there are a lot of resources there that I reference that people can, as they're reading, click on. I also have dialogues. So dialogues between ancient Christians and modern Christians to contrast the different ways of thinking that they had on many different topics, ranging from the sacraments to different types of spirituality. So that's there for anyone who's interested. And I think you'll have the name of my website at the end of the video.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of funny when I've talked to so many people that seem to find me, you know, in some ways knowledgeable, and I have no formal education in anything really to speak of. But what I try and tell them is, if you just follow the questions that arise within you and go find the answer. You know, we have Google now, we have the internet, we have a lot of places. And then as you start doing it, you'll start learning who some of the more reliable sources are. Who are some of the better places to turn to get answers to these questions. And I know that, you know, over the course of my becoming Orthodox and being Orthodox, I've consulted, and usually I read brief article length and even at times chapter length things to just grasp a concept, to get a hold of it. I've really found that talking to you and engaging and interacting with you and some of the things that you've said and written are invaluable resources, have been for me. And I think you're definitely, in my world personally, one of the go-tos when a question arises, especially in the matter of patristics. So I highly recommend others to go to your resources and find a wealth of information.
And again, it's all to the glory of God and the furthering of his kingdom. In the end, my hope is that that transforms people's lives, like it transformed mine from reading all these things. And that way we can live more fuller lives. And I may end with the quote where our Lord said, "I have come that they may have life and that they may have it more abundantly."
It's a good place to end. Thank you, Daniel.
Very welcome.